Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to do one of my favorite color combinations, black and white, with one of my favorite strategies, Aristocrats, with the new Fallout commander, Colonel Autumn. So let's take a look and see what he does right now. Colonel Autumn is a 1 white and black human soldier with lifelink and exploit. It means when it enters the battlefield, you can sack a creature. And then other legendary creatures you control have exploit, and whenever your creature you control exploits a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and it starts out as a 2/3. The thing here is that Autumn exploits coming in and then lets all of our other legends do the same thing when they come into the play, and then we can exploit and get more counters on all of our creatures. So that means we essentially get free sacrifice outlets for every legendary creature coming down, and it's going to buff up everything else we have on the battlefield. Tokens to sacrifice, death triggers, reanimation, tons of legends that are just good in our colors. Yeah, we can work with that. So for this build, we're going to focus on a Legends Matter type strategy that isn't reliant upon Ratadrabic of Urborg, infinite trigger shenanigans and things like that. He's not even going to show up in the deck. So let's start off with some token creators. All the following cards make tokens for us to exploit later, such as Adeline Resplendent Cathar. It gives us a 1/1 for each opponent when we attack with any of our creatures, and as long as those tokens survive combat, they become fodder for our plans later. Then there's Alaru Solemn Ritualist. It gives us a replacement token whenever we lose any of our non-token creatures with counters on them. Ideally, we've already exploited one of our legends out that already had counters on it, so then we can get the token creature off of it to be exploited again when we play our next legend. Then there's Alenda the Duskrows. Not only does this get bigger with every creature that dies, but then when we exploit her, we're going to be making a ton of vampire tokens off of this thing, which then can receive the +1/+1 counters down the line. The thing to remember with her is the tokens resolve before the +1/+1 counter trigger from the exploit, so the tokens will actually get the counters when you exploit Alenda off of it. Next up is a creature I've actually never played with before, but I found it as I was researching this deck, and it seems like it would be really good in this deck, and that is Felisa, Fang of Silverquill. Now, whenever a non-token creature we control dies, if it had counters on it, we're getting a 2/1 Inkling for each counter on the sacrificed creature. It seems just incredibly strong with what we're trying to do here, and gives us a bunch of flying bodies to stack +1/+1 counters onto with all of our future exploit. I'm also going to include a copy of one of my favorite legends that I've actually done a Historic Brawl video on, and that is Rhea Ivor, Bane of Bladehold. You pick the biggest thing that you can get past their defenses, and you hit them with it, and then Rhea is going to give you a number of 1/1 Phyrexian Mites equal to the damage that was dealt. You just then feed them to Colonel Autumn's war effort and then reap the benefits down the line, or you can create enough of them and simply just poison somebody out of the game. My next choice for the deck is actually recommended by somebody I follow on Twitter. It's the least Reverent Medium. It works in conjunction with all of the other token creators in the deck to essentially double up our token count by giving you more tokens at the end of each step for however many you've made during that turn, and you get it for each end step, not just your own. And then the last of the token creators, but definitely not least, and one of my personal favorites that I recommend for a lot of decks with black in them, Ghoul Caller Gisa. Early on, you'll get a few zombies off of her. In late game, this can turn a legend that was on the way out into a massive pile of zombies for us to stack counters onto to exploit or just crash into the red zone with. Moving on, let's look at our card draw effects that are going to be in this deck. Rather than our usual stuff like Black Market Connections or Phyrexian Arena, we're going to try some different routes in this deck, starting with Doomweaver. Pair this up with something, exploit the bonded creature, draw cards. Pretty nice setup, and it scales up with the creatures growing with the +1/+1 counters. The nice part here is that it can also pair up the incoming legend that did the exploiting. You just have to stack the triggers correctly when you do it so that the Soul Bond repair on the new creature doesn't resolve until the exploit trigger is already completed with the other creature. So, for example, to make this easy, the Doomweaver is paired with Adeline Resplendent Cathar. She's a 4/4 in this example. With Colonel Autumn out, you cast any other legend. You put a Soul Bond trigger on the stack, attaching it to this new legend that's coming in. You also put the exploit trigger from Autumn's triggering ability on the stack. Since they're both ETBs, you resolve the exploit first, sacrificing the Adeline. The draw trigger and the +1/+1 counters go on the stack. Once they've resolved, you'll have a new Soul Bond trigger to resolve, pairing it with the new creature that just came into the battlefield, and then you can use that again with the next thing you exploit and just keep chaining it for cards. Our next drawing ability here is going to come on Dusk Legion Duelist. Now, it's not as strong as the Doomweaver, but as we exploit and put counters on this, the Duelist is going to give us a card each turn that we can pull off an exploit trigger of any sort, and it's just going to build up as time goes on. Then we're also going to include a recommendation from the Hancock Ghoulish Mare deck tech I did just last week, and that is Vogar Necropolis Tyrant. This thing is really good. In this deck, it's going to grow as we exploit the other creatures. Then once we exploit it, it's going to give us a bunch of cards off of it because it looks at however many counters are on it and you draw cards equal to that when it dies. I'm also including a copy of Rankle, Master of Pranks. Now, this is a great creature to pick up counters with because then you can swing with large chunks of damage in the air that makes it harder to get rid of. But then it also can draw us a card when we need to and can act as removal or discard in spots as well. Another good flyer for the deck is Tomic, Wielder of Law from the new set. It's a really good card. It doesn't care who an opponent is actually attacking, only that they use 2 or more creatures when they do so. So that means even if they are attacking each other or you, either way, they're going to lose 3 life, you're going to draw the card, and it's going to punish that person for being such an aggressor. Also from the new set, we're going to include Teysa, Opulent Oligarch. Since we have a Drain package going to the deck, details on that coming up next, we have easy ways to ensure that we're going to be making our opponents lose life. It's going to be easy to score clue tokens off of Teysa, and then we can go ahead and crack 1 each turn, get a ghost on the board, also making a way to create token creatures on the board as well. And then the last card in our card draw package is one of the dual-sided Deans from Strixhaven, Shiley, Dean of Radiance, and Embrose, Dean of Shadow. Now with this, we're mostly interested in the Embrose side of the card and its ability to net us cards off our dying creatures with counters on them. I really like this card because we're able to exploit, dish out more counters, and then draw cards each time as long as it's out. So you exploit something, counters are going across the board, you exploit again, you're gaining cards as long as Embrose is sticking around. Now, as mentioned with Teysa, I have a Drain and Gain package in here. This batch of cards is going to do one thing for us, and it's going to do it very well, and that is drain life from our opponents, usually when a creature dies. And since we're deliberately feeding creatures to these exploit triggers, they make perfect sense to have in this deck and makes the basis of an aristocrat-style deck. So first is just a pile of cards that drain all of our opponents when a creature dies, no matter how it dies, starting with Cruel Celebrant, Vran, Executioner Thane, Alas Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim, Bastion of Remembrance, Agent of the Iron Throne, and Zulaport Cutthroat. Now, one thing with the Agent of the Iron Throne, you do have to have Colonel Autumn on the board for it to actually do anything because it ties that ability onto your commander, but otherwise these things will all drain when your creatures start dying. Vran is also limited to once per turn, but if you're sacrificing things off turn to other things, you can get extra triggers off of him as well. Then we have Sir Conrad the Grim. He's a little special in that he does not care who controlled the creature that died. It hits every opponent when a creature dies or hits the graveyard in any way. So if your opponent gets a creature card milled or discards a creature card, each of your opponents is getting drained for this. Then we have a few drains that work in a little different way, but can be very strong when combined with what we're doing in this deck. First up is Vito, Fanatic of Aclazotz. I've been looking for a home for this card, and this actually fits really well with what we're doing here. It depends on how many times we can exploit or just straight sacrifice creatures in a turn to trigger the separate events on him, but twice a turn is ideal so we can gain 2 life and drain a couple life out of each opponent. But on the occasion that you can do it 3 times in a turn, you're going to get a 4/3 flyer to smash in with as well to receive extra counters or just to exploit again later down the road. Another card I've been looking for a home with is Denethor, Ruling Steward. You have to pay into this to actually get a drain effect off of it, but it also gets us tokens if we sacrifice something on our own turn, which is kind of the goal here, to keep chaining these damage effects out. The last 2 drain cards we're going to swing into the AFR sets for. First up is Astarion the Decadent. Now this does not drain on its own, but when it's combined with the other drains and combat damage, he essentially doubles up damage dealt into a turn to one of our opponents, or in a pinch you can gain life equal to the amount that you've gained this turn, doubling that up as well. And then the last card, which works exceedingly well in this deck, is Saravok the Deathbringer. It's really easy for us to avoid burning ourselves with his ability, but our opponents are going to have to dance around to avoid this, and as it grows with the counters, it's going to do more and more damage to them as the game wears on, and if they run out of ways to get something to hit the graveyard, they're going to get burned really hard. Next up is the removal package I'm including here. We have some removal for the deck, but it's going to fit nicely with our plans and kind of fits the theme of what we're trying to do here. First up is Invasion of Fiora and Night of the Doctor from the Doctor Who sets. These could be used to work with all of our Legends Matter plans to either dodge them completely with the Invasion of Fiora by just naming non-legendary creatures, or to bring something back after it blows everything up in the case of Night of the Doctor. Then we have Retribution of the Ancients. This is likely the best removal in the entire deck. You pay a black, you remove +1/+1 counters from a creature, and get rid of anything, including indestructible creatures, and it's just repeatable as long as you have enough counters laying around and the mana to pay into the activation. Then we have a variety of exile removal at our disposal as well, starting off with Astarion's Thirst. This was a recommendation from the Hancock deck I did, and it works nicely here as well, getting rid of a big threat on their side of the board and putting a bunch of counters on somebody like Colonel Autumn or one of our other creatures that can punch them in the face. We're also including a copy of Swords to Plowshares. It's the original exile removal in the game. It's still one of the best out there, and it's getting a slot in this deck as well. We're also going to include a copy of Anguished Unmaking in here. It's just a cheap way to get rid of any non-land permanent, and with the drain and gain in the deck, the life loss of this is very negligible and very easy to pull off. Then we're going to put an oldie but goodie that works really well in this deck, and that is Karlov of the Ghost Council. It's a special tool in this deck. Anytime you gain life, it gets 2+1/+1 counters on top of any counters that we're bringing in with Autumn's exploit triggers, making it really easy to get to the 6 counters to remove and start firing it off and just taking out as many major threats as we need to as the game rolls along. And then the last couple removal spells that we have here are more specific in Lauren of the Third Path and a flavorful addition of Commander Sophia de Guerre. Lauren destroys artifacts and enchantments, Sophia destroys legendary permanents, and then with our next package of cards, then you can exploit them away and bring them back to do it all over again, and that new package is Reanimation and Recovery. This package is all about getting our stuff back that we've been exploiting away and putting them back on the field and recycling things, starting with Ravos Soul Tender. It gets a creature back to our hand every upkeep, as well as having a +1/+1 Lord effect for all of our creatures. We also have Carmen Cruel Sky Marcher from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan Precons. This goes up 2 counters with every exploit that we do and gets bigger with any other kind of sacrifices as well. And the bigger she gets, the bigger the target that she can reanimate from our graveyard. And it also does a good job of just creating recurring loops specifically to trigger our drains and +1/+1 counters by bringing something back and then exploiting the reanimated legend to itself. And then you can rinse and repeat that over and over and over again. Now, I rarely jump over to the 40k cards because I wasn't really messing around with those decks too much, but there's one card in there that I think fits this deck very well, and that is Celestine the Living Saint. It's a similar design to Carmen, but instead of triggering off of the counters that are on her, it's based off the amount of life you've gained by the end of your turn. So as counters get put on her, she can hit harder and harder, gaining larger chunks of life to bring bigger and bigger things back. Plus, all of the drain and gain effects can also help pad her ability to bring something bigger back. I'm also going to include a copy of Junji the Midnight Sky. It's a great card to just, exploit, mostly so it can bring other things back for us, but in some cases you'll want to use it to attack someone's hand with the discard effect. It's also very nice that these abilities are tacked onto this creature so we can just reuse it with all these other reanimation abilities that we have access to. So you should be able to juggle Junji several times. And speaking of being able to juggle things, we also have Priest of Felrights in this deck. We can actually bring back other creatures with her, and then you don't even need to use the Unearth ability to bring it back with all the other reanimation. We can go ahead and bring it back and use her again to bring something back, and it just might come in handy in an emergency case. You might want to use that, but if you're guaranteeing somebody's going to get finished off by using it up and using the Unearth ability, go ahead and do it. But I would recommend leaving her in the graveyard to keep juggling her back and forth. Then we have a little, what I would call a hidden gem for this deck, and that is Together Forever. It works really good in this deck because it only needs to have a creature with a counter on it and a little bit of mana to pay into the ability. So if someone goes to wipe the board, you can just pay as much as you have for however many creatures have counters on them, and you get to bring all those things back to your hand when the wipe resolves. Another gem, and it's actually quite old, and that is Oversold Cemetery, but it does not see enough love in my opinion. So since we're wanting to juggle our creatures in and out of the graveyard, the Cemetery acts as like a secondary version of Ravos, with only the caveat that it needs 4 or more creatures in the yard to bring something back. But in this deck, it really shouldn't be an issue. I'm also going to include a copy of Victimize in the deck. This is one of my favorite reanimation spells from the history of Magic. This thing came out way back in the Urza block. For 3 mana and a sacrificed fodder creature, you can get back any 2 creatures from your graveyard. It is a seriously underutilized card in Commander, and it was just recently reprinted as a special guest, but that copy version is very expensive. Unless you're really wanting that art, I don't recommend buying that copy of it. Just get one of the lesser copies for like $1 or $2 and use that instead. Then I have another one of the Soulbond creatures like the Doomweaver. We have Breathkeeper Seraph that allows us to bring back itself and the bonded creature. And like the Doomweaver, if you stack your exploits correctly, you can keep a creature constantly paired with the Seraph, and you can just keep juggling things out of the graveyard, repeating the enters the battlefield triggers and death triggers, and you just keep rolling them along with that Soulbond. Then we have Witch of the Moors, which can get things back at the end of our turn by just simply gaining a little life off of our lifelink creatures, or a drain and gain effect that we have several of in the deck, and then it gets to force them to sacrifice a creature as well, and then you're bringing something back. So it's just a good card to have in the deck. And then the last two are actually a pair of gods from Theros that are the same god, but two different versions of the card. First up is Athreos, God of Passage. This will eventually force your opponents into some really bad choices. Every exploited creature, if an opponent doesn't lose 3 life, it's going to come right back to our hand. And they might be able to pay up early in the game, but the more you damage them with other means and the game grinds on, eventually they're going to have to let those creatures come back to your hand. And we're also going to include the other Athreos Shroud Veiled. Unlike the original version, we're going to get any creatures back that have coin counters on them, and they come straight back into play, not your hand. So then we can do that with our opponent's creatures as well, setting up to swipe them when they get destroyed or even exiled. And then the last package we have in the deck is all about the +1/+1 counters, the main feature of all this exploiting that we're doing. It's going to help us, spread the counters out a little bit quicker with some proliferates. We're going to have ways of growing creatures, of protecting things that have counters on them. There's a bunch of things that are going to be featured in this particular subset of cards, starting with Staff of Completion. Now, this thing is a way to act as a proliferate engine in the deck to crank the counters up a little bit faster, but it also acts as a mana rock when necessary, and it's really not that hard to pay life into its abilities to keep it rolling along because of all the drain and gain we've already talked about. Then there's Animation Module, which serves a couple of purposes here. When we put a counter on a creature, we can pay a colorless and make a 1/1 servo token, which can then be fed into exploits later. Alternatively, we can use the activated ability on occasion to add counters to a target, but this ability is better suited to things like Planeswalkers or ramping up sagas ahead of schedule, but we're not really running any of that, so it's not something we really want to mess with that often. Then we have Junji's Running Mate, Ao the Dawn Sky in here, allowing us to scatter extra counters around when we exploit it, or we can retrieve permanents from the deck by using its ability to look at the top 7 and get some smaller stuff. Choose your own adventure and go wild with the card. I'm also including a copy of Sengir, the Dark Baron, in the deck. It grows by 2 counters with every creature deck, and since we're feeding all this stuff into the exploit plan, it's going to grow enormous really quickly and is going to become a must-deal-with threat very rapidly. And then remember how I talked about a way to protect using the counters? We're going to include Basri's Lieutenant. It synergizes extremely well in this deck. Anything with a counter on it when it dies will leave another 2/2 creature behind for it. And then the plan is going to be exploiting our legends with more legends. So we should be able to chain 2/2s off of this as we exploit down the line. I'm also going to include a card that I've not yet found a home for, but I think it fits really good here, and that is Lyzel Vlaakith's Champion, if I pronounce that correctly. It's an oddball for white in that +1/+1 counter doubling has pretty much been relegated exclusively to green in the last few years, but here it is on a mono white creature that was just printed in the last few years. So we're going to go ahead and take advantage of it in our deck to help speed up the clock on our opponents. And with that thought in mind, we're going to hit the final card of this package, and it's a finisher in the package, and that's Sigarda's Summons. With all these counters coming down on our creatures, we should easily be able to turn our entire side of the board into 4/4 angels, and they're going to have flying as well, and they should be able to just come down on our opponents like a hammer. And then the last 2 cards in the main deck here that serve similar purposes, and that is copying triggers, and that is Gandalf the White. It copies anything that our legends have going on, including those exploit triggers, so when the things are exploiting, it's going to trigger twice and put 2 counters on things. And we also have Teysa Karlov sitting here, who's going to do our death trigger jig. So we're going to have things dying, those drain triggers and whatnot. It's going to copy those triggers as well. The last subset of cards that I want to talk about here, and this is separate from the deck that you're going to see in the deck list. These are cards that I would call turbo-powered or expensive upgrades. Somebody had mentioned, a couple different people had actually, that some of my decks are getting a little expensive as I'm putting them up. Well, I wanted to keep this deck under $200. So in order to do that, I separated these cards off. These are cards that would work really well in the deck, but they might be frowned upon, or they might be just too expensive to acquire right away. So let's talk about those now, starting with Grave Pact. Now, this card is great here because we can exploit a creature and it would take out one of your opponent's creatures for each of your opponents, but it can be frowned upon because you can chain this so much that your opponents are left with nothing while you're doing everything. So use that at your own risk. I'd also include Yawgmoth Thran Physician for the proliferate for the counters, because then we get extra sacrifice triggers and do things like that. We can discard cards to do that. There's a bunch of ways we can use this to just our benefit here. We also have Kokusho the Evening Star in my list of powered up upgrades. Now, I did not realize this card was as expensive as it was. It's gone up in price quite a bit over the years, but it's a really good card in this deck because if you exploit it, you drain your opponents, and then you get to bring it back with the Reanimation package and do it again, and you can chain this over and over again. I'd also include a copy of the Meat Hook Massacre in here if you have access to it because of the drain effect that's on there, and it's just a good way to wipe the board when necessary. And then the last card I would include is the new Vein Ripper, which got a little expensive thanks to the Pioneer format and the decks that incorporate it now. But it's a great card here because just like all these other draining gain effects that are in the deck, they lose 2 when something dies, and as you're exploiting, you're going to be able to drain them for 2. And unlike Vran, there's no cap on that. You can just do it over and over again until you run out of mana or things die on a wipe. So that's my ideas for the Colonel Autumn Commander. I call the deck Exploiting the Masses. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, if you liked what I'm doing here, please like, comment, subscribe. All those good things help me on my road to my first 1,000 subscribers. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.